and it helps people start businesses because unless, because of globalization, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it, countries tend to be subjected to brain drain.
Yeah.
But anyone who does well goes to California. You want to make sure these people stay here. Now, how can you keep them here? By giving them the ingredients they would get in California. And in California, it's not for the weather, they're moving to California, all right? It's not, you don't have to give them the weather. What they get in California is peers, an atmosphere, that kind of critical mass of people talking to one another, and risk-taking. Because it's very, very, very acceptable in California to fail. Like you fail with your recipe, you added something that doesn't work, you give it to someone else. You say, you give it to your father-in-law, you get the idea? So you keep trying, you don't have, the cost of failure is low. So maintain a low cost of failure for people, particularly social stigma.
But for me personally, it's very important to have a mass of people in all countries, in every country, and in Kazakhstan in particular, who has this, critical thinking. And the only way for me to have all these critical thinkers is to have a very good universities and education.
The problem is we got too many people who think. And we also have, even worse, too many people who talk. You want people who are actually doing things.
Doing something, yeah.
So universities, they teach people that thinking is good. Thinking is not good. You need people to do things.
But how they can do without thinking?
But that's the whole idea. The history of mankind comes from, people have this illusion that science leads to technology. And technology leads to application. Reality is applications lead to technology, and technology leads to science. So we have the arrow backwards. I mean, science is very useful, but we should focus on innovation and technology, and that doesn't come from universities. If anything, universities teach people how to not innovate. You see? It's a complete backward paradigm. I mean, look at entrepreneurs in America. Did universities help them start businesses? I have this. Sorry.
No.
Okay, let's go through the biography of this guy. Who made this product? Steve Jobs. Okay. Did he go to university to learn how to make that product, and then when he graduated, he got his diploma, and listened to some idiotic speech, and then went and started his company? No, he's a dropout. Okay, and but they lived in an atmosphere where there was that atmosphere of technology where you can learn from one another. People learn from one another, not from a professor. You see, they learn from one another, and that's for technology.
Okay.
So you should encourage that by having universities. What are they going to learn? Sociology? What are they going to learn? Theory, mathematics? It's useful, but it's not essential. What is essential is the know-how. You don't learn how to ride a bicycle at university. We still don't know the physics of riding a bicycle, by the way. You learn to ride a bicycle by riding a bicycle. So you make people ride bicycles, and then they need some kind of deepening to go study thermodynamics or whatever it is. But training happens by doing things.
And your method was to read the books. Is that right? I mean, you not skip education, but you prefer to read the books?
No. I mean, education is important, but education, people have the illusion that that because rich countries have high degree of education, that you get rich by raising the level of education. In fact, it's backwards. Countries that today are both rich and have high degree of education were first rich, and then education went up. As a matter of fact, education inhibits risk-taking. It is important to have education for those who want to do science, for those who want to do theory, and a little bit for the rest. But thinking that all the solutions are going to come from education, it's a big trap.
practice first.
Practice, exactly.
Okay, and if we are going back to government and state, in this part of the world, governments love to plan and to have all these strategies through, decades to 2030, 50 or something. Is that works at the moment? Is it possible to have a plan for, 3 decades?
I mean, it depends. I mean, why do you want to have a plan, right? Visibly, if you need to build an airport, you need to have some kind of a plan.
Yes.
And also plans can be used, for just, to give people the some kind of, to lower their anxiety. Mm-hmm. So you have the feeling you don't have an anxiety, okay? And also to make people do things. Mm-hmm. But if you think that that you're going to be able to predict what happens in 2030, let me know, because I got something. I may have some few projects for you. Particularly, we can figure out what happens in the market and do a lot of interesting things. But the idea of a plan is something that should not be used for what it is. Mm-hmm. A plan is like when you wake up in the morning, you have a plan of what you're going to do, all right? Mm-hmm. But you're not prisoner of that plan. Yeah. Like if I'm looking for example, let's take pharma, okay, pharmaceutical company, and you're looking for a drug. Typically, you have a plan. Okay, this is a disease, cancer, and we have a plan to come up with a drug that will, address the symptoms or the cause of that thing, whatever. Okay. But like 95% of the time, you're going to have to change your plan because typically the side effects you encounter may lead to another drug. Like, for example, aspirin. Aspirin was brought to market to lower, as a fever reducer, antipyretic. And then later on, someone discovered that it was used as a headache medicine, as a painkiller. So what do you mean it's not in a plan, that it's a painkiller? So pharma has benefited from the fact that its mistakes turned out to be more profitable than its intention. So, and actually today, aspirin is used as a blood thinner, the third application. That was not part of the plan. A lot of the medicines you find in the market are not there for what they were designed for. You see, that's not part of the plan. So the idea is, knowing that you have a plan, okay, that's the plan, but you should have at every point in time the ability to flip and go in a different direction. See? So in that sense, a plan is useful. But if you're locked into a plan and say, oh, sorry, no, we're looking for a headache medicine, it cures cancer. No, that's not the plan. The plan is a headache medicine. Well, then you're going to be, locked into a plan. It's going to be a bad thing. So the idea is you have to maximize optionality around the plan. Toward the end of in the penultimate part of Anti-Fragile, I talk about these plans. There's a plan as a prison, like you get on a highway and you have no exit. Yeah. Okay. But if I decide to go to California, I got a highway and I have about 500 exits between New York and Los Angeles, then it's not a big deal. I noticed, hey, this is a great town. I'm going to spend days here, and okay, maybe I change my plan. You see, so a plan you can change easily is robust. Something you can't change anymore because once it's unleashed, you're stuck in it, is a problem.
And back to globalization, you said that we will talk about this. I strongly believe that it was not a surprise for you, results of referendum and elections in Britain and US last year.
So yes.
It was a surprise for you.
I mean, the point is that it was neither a surprise nor something I expected. Okay. You see, you train yourself to say, okay, it's fine, but let me tell you something, but deep down, I like what's happening. Okay. For the following reason. I wrote in The Black Swan that globalization creates winner-take-all effects. like Google running, okay, you didn't have that before. Google suddenly is running our lives. Winner-take-all effect. And you have authors like Harry Potter, right? Everybody now on the whole planet reads Harry Potter. Last century, you had more of an ecology, right? And now everybody's speaking English, I guess, from what I noticed, right? So you have winner-take-all effects, culturally, economically, and that's not sustainable. Mm-hmm. So you need to sort of like reduce it a little bit, not much. So the problem with newspapers is that they're linguistically very developed. Mm-hmm. And that's one thing you learn from law. I was in jury duty and I learned a lot. I learned that whenever a lawyer uses something, they define it. Okay? They define everything. It's so precise, and effectively in New York State, you can even get the precise definition by taking the code. When they mean, what they mean by a felony. A felony is, and they give you exactly the definition of felony. Mm-hmm. But when journalists talk about anti-globalization, or they're not defining it. So it means, so let me explain what's going on. There's 100% globalization, means absolutely, all right, that's probably what firms like Procter & Gamble and multinational firms would like, mm-hmm. All right? And then there's 0% globalization, which means that we cook our own, we live in autarky and in a village, and basically you live on subsistence from near land. That's 0% globalization. Mm-hmm. So Donald Trump says he doesn't want 0% globalization, so he's not anti-globalization. Mm-hmm. He is, say, for 95% globalization. So reduce down by 5% to protect some businesses, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. So that's not anti-globalization. So anti-globalization is someone wants 0, not 95%, all right? Being against 100% mm-hmm. is not being against something, you see? So like I am against some aspect of globalization. Mm-hmm. So you need, to make goods and services circulate, but not in an unfettered way, simply because distortions have a heavy social price. Mm-hmm. And the system will blow up otherwise. So 10 years after I wrote about it in the Black Swan, now people are starting to say, oh yeah, winner take all effects. But that's the problem, is that you have to address cosmetics at some point. So Donald Trump is not against globalization. You see, if you look at it, it's not like, it's just some fine-tuning of the process. And effectively, I thought he would be for 80% globalization. It turned out to be more like 95, maybe 97%. Mm-hmm. You see? Yeah. And when we say our relationship with China, we don't want to stop buying products from China. Mm-hmm. There's a difference between buying everything from China and buying nothing from China, you see? So when you read the problem with the press is they don't use language mm-hmm. like scientists do, or like businessmen. Businessmen are very precise when they mean something. I'm buying this shirt from you, people understand exactly what your order is. But when I read newspapers, particularly in the United States, mm-hmm. it's as if in the United States you had to find people who don't understand anything, all right? Put them all in one industry, all right? And make them talk about the world. And that's what happened with the journalists in the United States. So you can't really take it at face value because their language is not precise enough. So, and then they talk about democracy without defining it. Define mm-hmm. governance without defining it, stuff without defining it. So what's happening today is largely an illusion by people having the feeling that, hey, we're going back to 1930. We're not going back to 1930.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we will go to audience because we have a very limited time. Есть ли вопросы у зала? Я знаю, что один как минимум был вопрос. А? Да. It's in English.
In English. Okay, go ahead. Да. Yeah.
Просто громко, да?
Ну, я думаю, что да.
Okay.
Towards a what? Cashless. Yes.
Because we don't have any, it starts with education and how anti-fragile the final product.
No, okay, fragile it would be, because there's several things. A cashless society means electronic, and so you're relying on electronic currency. Let's assume that there is a shutdown of the internet. How are you going to transact? Okay, so visibly, you know, you need the physical thing. And and we've seen some crises. I was in New York in 2003 when there was New York was not robust, because you couldn't wash your hands because the thing was electric. So you couldn't get water, all right? There's no way to get water. You could not manage anything because everything was based on a system that required electricity. So it was total mayhem in New York for 48 hours. And actually even 100 million people were without electricity, but New York City without electricity is something crazy, okay? So you realize that you can't rely on but it's likewise, now the problem is much deeper with money. If you say we're going to have a cashless society, who said that? Okay, well, someone is trying to control my life by saying I cannot transact with you with cash. That's very intrusive. And someone can monitor all my transactions. Now, what if I want to do things that are none of anybody's business? Okay? I want to use my money because I have a secret habit I don't want to share with the rest of the people. Okay? Anything that goes online is effectively public. There's practically nothing about you that goes online that's not potentially public for anyone who wants it. You say I have a secret habit of eating carbs, all right? And I don't tell anybody I'm eating carbs. And then people say, oh, this guy is ordering French baguettes online, for example. It's nobody's business. But it can go deeper. You may have secret habits that are different, you know, like not ordering French baguette, but something else. So transactions have to be, so you're reducing human freedom by deciding how they should transact. And it's not going to work, you see. And then people say, okay, we're going to do that to monitor, first of all, the professions, like the oldest profession, all right, or other professions that will not survive, okay?
What is the risk?
What do you see as being the risk side of some catastrophic failure if it's centralized particularly if it's centralized at some global level?
Okay, everything that is connected to network is subjected to risk of catastrophic failure. It's just that we don't know quite the probability, all right? Networks like grids, electric grids, are subjected to catastrophic failure, but the internet is something that is very vulnerable. So if you have you depend on electronic transaction, plus it can be hacked. Unlike electric grids, so you may have someone trying to actually do harm to the system. Okay? Plus you have other things. It's not that it's centralized, it's the fact that it's a network. If on top of that, transactions are now centralized, then it's beyond catastrophic failure. It's the idea of someone may be able to take advantage of the system. You see, the idea of decentralization is that you have a lot of small units, a lot of small islands, and they deal with one another, so you're introducing layers of relationships. You have a town that deals with a province, and province deals with another province, and then you have a country that deals with other countries. That's like a federation works well in the United States. You have counties, states, and then the federal system. But the focus is on the small entities. But likewise in transactions, the more you centralize, the more things fail. And we saw that what happened with the British. I was actually, it's very strange because I was attacking. There's a fellow after Tony Blair, who's not as bad, but not very smart. His name Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown had a theory that if a pin is dropped in the Lake District in the UK, we ought to hear it in Whitehall, which is, where they have 38,000 civil servants, humorless civil servants, in the middle of London by the Parliament. So that centralization caused the problem we had recently, the hacking of the NIH, you see. So and actually the other problem that people don't realize, it's very costly, it seems cheaper, but they realize that large projects, particularly when they have an IT component, are disproportionately more vulnerable to cost overruns. So it looks cheaper, but eventually you pay a lot more, because IT is where the cost overruns are the largest. So it's better to have small little manageable things communicating with one another, and then the government deals with the top structure rather than deal with all the way down, because it's not as easy to control. So, which is why centralization will actually, it won't even happen. Okay, we had the president, I don't know if you remember him, Obama. I'm trying to forget about him every day I wake up. So Obama increased our costs of, we have a problem with healthcare in America, mostly because America is a very large country. Okay, it's a continent. And centralizing healthcare, and the way he did it, okay, is exact opposite of the way it should be done. Set it bottom up with different islands dealing with, with one another. You have, and with the government on top if they want to get involved. He integrated everything. And of course, we saw what happened. And now I'm glad that President Trump removed it.
Окей. Есть у нас время на один буквально вопрос. Если он есть, пожалуйста.
По-русски?
ممكن سؤال باللغة العربية. На арабском языке, если возможно.
Еще раз?
На арабском языке.
He wants to speak in Arabic.
سيد نسم طالب. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أهلا وسهلا بكم إلى كازاخستان. وعندي سؤال باللغة العربية إذا هذا ممكن.
Yes.
كما نعرف أنتم مؤلف كتب للتطوير شخصية. وعندي سؤال شخصية ما هو سر النجاح في الحياة في التوفيق.
So let me translate what he's saying. He's asking me, you write books about success, and is that what you said? And what is the secret of success in life? That's the worst possible question.
الجواب باللغة العربية أولا ثم
I prefer.
شكرا.
Okay. So no. Let me answer on several levels. The first one is that the worst question you can ever ask me is success, something to do with success, because success is misdefined. Again, if you look analytically, and I gave a lecture at AUE in Lebanon, a graduation thing, where they asked me, I told them, success is an invention for business schools. So what is success is when you're, whatever age you're going to be at, you look at yourself at the age 18. You look at yourself in a mirror, imagining your 18-year-old is looking at you, and then you're not ashamed. And that is the idea of being successful. When you take the old Mediterranean Greek values, success is mostly feeling honorable. Okay? That is success. Success is not, so when people, success is idiosyncratic, okay? So the idea of the success is defined by having power in an organization. That's not success, okay? For me, it's not success. Having to go to meetings is not success. Success for the Greeks was dying on the battlefield, because that way you've terminated your life in a nice way without suffering too much. without extending, without being on a hospital bed. Okay, that's success. So define success, but if you go to classical values, are the ones that are still valid today, and going to be valid in the future, is just like when Solon was asked, hey, who was happier, and happy meant successful, sort of, in that context. He said, this fellow, and he died in battle. He had children, he was liked by the community, and he died in battle. Well, that was success, okay? So success is mostly avoidance of things that make you feel shame. If you start with that principle, that core thing, and then everything else becomes easy, you see? And then the second point is in Arabic. I'm against speaking Arabic because I don't believe that the Levant, where I come from, speaks Arabic. I think that it's marketing because the dialects of the Levant are much older than Arabic. And so answering you, and I'd rather answer you in the languages the people that try to market that it's not it's not Arabic that people speak. It is an older language actually, closer to Phoenician, Canaanite.
Okay, Dr. Tarek, we have another speaker who just came.
We have Mr. Franco.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure for us. Спасибо большое за ваше время. Мы будем беседовать со следующим нашим спикером буквально через 3-4 минуты. Поэтому не уходите.
Great, thanks. Thank you very much. Thanks. I'm honored to be here.
Через некоторое время вы сможете в этом убедиться, это проверить. Мы продолжаем серию наших интервью. Наш второй гость из трех, Питер Франкопан, историк, человек, который преподает в Оксфорде и сейчас получил приглашение еще, как минимум в один университет, насколько я знаю. Это человек, который очень хорошо знает историю шелкового пути, и, собственно, про шелковый путь его ключевая работа, которая стала бестселлером, «Шелковый путь. Новая история мира». Мы поговорим с ним в том числе об истории нашего региона, поговорим о Китае, о том, чего нам ждать о Китае и так дальше. И мы примерно так же построим нашу сессию, то есть у нас примерно полчаса. Поэтому, если у вас будут вопросы, дайте об этом знать. В самом конце будет небольшое время на то, чтобы их задать. Ильяс, если у тебя есть вопрос, подними руку сейчас и дай мне знать об этом, чтобы я в этот раз тебе все-таки дал слово. So, we will talk about your area of interests, I believe, about Silk Road, about this region. You are one of the just few researchers history of this region and based your academic work on. First, my question is why you are interested in Silk Road and why do you believe that not new history but history of the world was started here or something? If we can.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk. Well, there's the sort of the short answer, I suppose, is that when I was young, I fell in love with Russia, actually, and Russian history. And I was very lucky. I studied Russian at school and at university. And in my last year at Cambridge, I studied a paper that looked at the interactions between early Russia, Kiev and Rus, with Constantinople and Baghdad. And it introduced me to a world that I'd learned nothing about it at school. I'd never heard about the importance of Central Asia. I never heard the word Silk Roads. I never heard about China being important. Everything that I read in the newspapers, everything that I was taught about in school was always about Western Europe. And I'm a child of the Cold War. When I grew up, everything in Western Europe was about freedom. Everything else in other parts of the world was about lack of freedom and problems. And in fact, even when I had a map, I start my book, I had a map on my wall when I was a boy, And it seemed to me that the world is quite a big place, and that if you study only the history of yourself and your own immediate surroundings, then you miss out on understanding the world properly. So the truth is that the Silk Roads themselves and these connections evolved into much later into my research. But as a boy, I think it was just realizing that the world that I was being taught about didn't reflect the reality. When I switched on, when I did watch the news, I saw SS-20 missiles being deployed in eastern Germany. I saw things going on in China. I saw the war in Cambodia. I saw a revolution in Iran. And the history I was being taught at school and I read about taught me nothing about these places.
And why do you think this region is important for the world now?
I think it's important now, and the same reason it's been important since the beginning of time. Okay. I mean, the first ever cities in human history were created in what's now Iraq, in Mesopotamia. The first ever laws that were ever written in the same place. The Garden of Eden was thought to be there too. And all of our global religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, have all been brought by travelers, by merchants, by explorers, by holy people, along the big trade routes that have connected ultimately North Africa and Western Europe right the way through this part of the world, the center of Asia, and through to China. And it's true, 2,500 years ago, news and goods didn't travel so fast like they do today. But our ancestors have always been interested in fashion. They've always been interested in expensive items that are rare. They've always been interested in technology. They've always been interested in fact, about learning about other people on the other side of the world, both for reasons of curiosity, because we as a species, we're curious. We're interested in ideas as human beings. I have a dog. He's not interested in anything apart from eating. And but I think this exchange of knowledge has been something that defines us as an animal, and there's no difference to that thousands of years ago than there is today. But it just so happens that we sit here in Kazakhstan. You could say the same thing in Iran, Iraq. This bit in the middle of Asia, the middle of the continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa, where everything always has happened, and that has been the same thousands of years ago. It was the same. 1,000 years ago, it's the same even actually 100 years ago. If you understand and look at the story of even the First and Second World Wars, we see history where what was happening in Iran, in Central Asia, and the steppes has been hugely important, even to things that we don't ever connect. It's just the way that we look at the past is always from the same perspective. And I think that in a world where we read about globalization, where we recognize how much more connected we are, seeing and studying those connections in the past and the present seems to me a very, not just a useful thing to do, but it seems to me essential to see how we've exchanged, how we've learned from each other and borrowed, and how we're connected.
But why this very important, according to you, region, very important in the history and just 100 years ago, why it's not very influential region when we are talking about global issues, when we are talking about global economy, when we are talking about global politics?
You mean today?
Yeah.
Well, unless I'm mistaken, the only things that I can see that really matter, that are going on in the world today, all are taking place across what are called the Silk Road countries, right? So that includes from Syria with state failure in Iraq, the rise of Taliban and Al-Qaeda forces and Islamic extremism across the whole region, not just in Iraq where we read about it, in Syria where we see it in the press, but also in Afghanistan and increasingly in places like Tajikistan and in Turkmenistan, where there are proper problems at the border points. We see a question of Iran and its position in the family of countries, dealing with its very complicated relationship with Saudi Arabia. We see in the last week Qatar being isolated, it's not just diplomatically, but physically isolated from the rest of the Gulf. We see India and Pakistan and their evolutions in different directions, both defined against each other, and then China. Everything that's happening in the world that it is important and is of interest is happening in that central space between the Mediterranean and the Pacific coast of China. And in the grand scheme of things, I come from London yesterday, Brexit is genuinely meaningless in this world where 4.5 billion people live. What happens with Brexit has some footnote in how Kazakhstan will develop.
But we here in Kazakhstan know more about Brexit than we know about, this Indian-Pakistan relations or something.
Yes.
Why?
But I understand that. That's partly because the winners write history, and Western Europe and the West for the last 300 or 400 years has been the dominant global geography and the global dominant culture. 100 years ago, during the First World War, even Belgium, which is smaller than the smallest province in Kazakhstan, Belgium had an empire in the Congo, which was an enormous entity. And because the West has had this history for which it should be very proud, and there are obviously dark spots in Western history as well that need to be calibrated, but Western Europe and the West has set the agenda for what is important. That's where the great artists, the great musicians, the great scholars have come from, but that's no guarantee that it will continue to be like that in the future. So, of course, we look back in that way, in the same way that you look back at a grand palace that was once inhabited by a family that was important. Of course, you visit these places for museums, but that doesn't mean that the future lies there too. And I think we have a big problem with this in Europe right now, of understanding what is our place in the cosmos, what is our place in the global community where seats on the Security Council, established global economies, are being put under pressure by change in the rest of the world. And one of the stories about Brexit was its connection to globalization, which ultimately means the reaction to the fact that places like China have been growing very substantially at our expense, perceived or otherwise. The things that Trump talked about during his election campaign, saying the Chinese are ripping us left, right and center, and we will stop and put a stop to Chinese economic growth. Or, which Trump, by the way, says about Germany as well, that we're going to stop buying German cars because he visited, when he visited Europe a couple of weeks ago. There is a real anxiety in Europe and in the West about how to manage this process of change. And there are some voices, some very influential voices in the United States who are talking in terms of dealing with China or managing the process of China through some form of intervention, potentially military, potentially economic, potentially cultural, which seems to me a very dangerous thing to do, because as a historian, you can't stand in the way, like King Canute famously put his chair in the ocean to show that he couldn't control the water. When the wave is coming towards you, there's nothing you can do about that. And but the language of trying to block and change globalization seems to me something which is wishful thinking and will do a great deal of damage if tariffs go up, because it protects inefficient businesses and it moves the West, in fact, in the opposite direction to places like Kazakhstan, where here you're trying to privatize your businesses, you're trying to have lower state involvement in the running of the economy, you're trying to bring in the best business investment, the best scholars, the best people to come and advise, and other parts of the world are going in the opposite direction of trying to put up walls. In fact, symbolically as well as literally, these discussion about how we can build a wall across, how the Americans could build a wall across with Mexico, or how we can fortify the borders of Hungary to put up barbed wire to stop movement of people. So, we are struggling with these questions too in the West.
What Asia in general, or maybe Central Asia, will change in the future? How you see this picture?
Well, there are lots of different, that's a very good question. There are lots of different ways to answer it. There are lots of different megatrends that I and I'm sure many people here try and keep an eye on. One is about the growth of the megacity and urbanization. Deal with each other, whether it's through organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, whether it's through Eurasian unions of one kind or another, or through Belt and Road initiatives. It seems to me that this is a world that is growing and waking up to these kind of possibilities and trying to find ways to plan for that future. And that seems to me both very sensible, but as a historian, I would assume that some of these initiatives will work much better than others, and in some cases, parts of initiatives will work better in some places than others. So there will be some unevenness of development, but control of resources, access to food, water, ability to control the environment, ability to provide energy and so on, plus pressures of politics of large urban populations, which we know, the Russian Revolution ultimately trace its trigger back to Central Asia, and this is where the first problems appeared were in Tashkent in 1916, before they telegraphed through to Petrograd. Central Asia is a very sensitive barometer of change that can be happening many thousands of miles away, because this is the natural global crossroads, and it always has been.
And let's go to China and talk a bit about this country. Here we know a lot about their new program, New Silk Road, as we can say. What do you think about this program? Is it something that will change the world and cooperation between countries at the West, in the East, at the East, or will change role of this region and role of the China, or it's something just political that will not work?
Yes, well, you in Kazakhstan have had a very particular experience these last 27 years or so, or 25 years since the fall of the Soviet Union, because you here have lived through a change that happened fast, as fast and as dramatic as any that's ever happened in this part of the world, any country actually. The switch from the kinds of buildings we can see in Astana that arose up. It's not even 20 years old yet, Astana, more or less 20 years old. So you're familiar here of what sudden, rapid change can do. You're familiar with the benefits that brings and the kinds of issues and problems and hurdles that it presents as well, right? But I think there's no question that the scale of what it is that China is not just proposing to do, but is actually doing, has the ability to transform the lives for not for millions or for even tens of millions or hundreds of millions. It has the potential to change the life of billions of people. So, just as one particular example, one of the strands of the Belt and Road Initiative is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, where the population of Pakistan roughly is about 200 million people. The general assumption is that a successful series of investments that are proposed may raise the GDP of Pakistan by 3 to 7%. And that's a scale that is almost incalculable in terms of its impact it will have on the education of children, of women, access to clean water, transportation links, ability for people to have reliable energy sources that allow their lights to work at night, allow digital connections that either don't exist or are unreliable. And the process of poverty alleviation, of changes to gender roles, of hierarchies and so on, it's on a biblical scale. The question is whether the Belt and Road Initiative will play out smoothly. There are lots of challenges to big investment, and everybody will know that it's being offered large amounts of money never come exactly for free, right? This isn't an aid project. Being able to pay your obligations is important, and one of the challenges will be what happens when 1, 2, 3 or more of these massive projects run into financial difficulty. What kind of partner will the Chinese be? And that's the question that, because of the banking crisis that happened all over the world 10 years ago, we have some experience of, because a bank has an opportunity to restructure or to take some of the pain along with the customers, or to inflict punishment when somebody defaults. And that process of learning who you're dealing with, it's like any kind of relationship. It's like a marriage. You realize when you have a difficult period, how well equipped are you to solve the problem? Are you both equally incentivized to problem? And I think we don't yet know, because it's still so new, how asymmetric this resolution will be.
And what kind of marriage it will be between China and other countries like Kazakhstan and other countries in Central Asia?
Correct, and there's, of course, that's on the high level, but then there are individual commercial relationships between individual Chinese entities that may or may not have closer links to the Chinese government, and then their investments here, and then how are these resolved? Are they resolved through the AIFC here that's being set up in Astana? How smoothly will that run? And having justice that's delivered in this kind of way through English common law, it gives me comfort to know that there will be independent. But if you and I have a dispute, the fact that somebody independent resolves it doesn't make you happy if you lose,
Yes.
right? So I think that it's about trying to future scope and proof how to build those kinds of resolutions, particularly where there's so much at stake. And we're in parts of the world where pride and and how we see ourselves is hugely important. People are proud people here in Kazakhstan, rightly so, as in China and so on. And because there is a real sense that this is a world that is moving in everybody else's favor, holding your position and being proud is something that can, while I understand it, can also be a weakness as well in the negotiating position. But I think that so much has happened in the last 4 years. It's quite hard to see what happens in the future. And as a historian, I suppose it's a very boring thing to say, but again, with Nassim Taleb, he would agree with me if he was sitting here. It can take one completely random event somewhere else in the world that can derail this process. So, although I spend a lot of time looking at, for example, there've been, kidnapping of Chinese workers in Pakistan, which is hugely damaging. These kind of unstable processes. 100 years ago, the reason why there was a world war that dragged in from India to Australia, Germany, Russia, so on, the Russian Revolution triggered as a result, was because an Austrian man was shot in Sarajevo. And then the world descended into warfare. So, we are in we live in a super fragile world where it doesn't take much to derail plans, and what happens in North Korea, what happens in Washington, what happens in Tehran, what happens in Qatar, can have these very strange and unexpected consequences, even for these massive investment projects of Belt and Road. So I think the thing to do is to make plans, but always be ready to adapt. And again, here in Kazakhstan, because it's been a tougher 2 or 3 years than probably you were expecting 5 or 10 years ago, that has produced a reality about how hard it is to do well. That people never write fantastic books or build great companies by chance. It's the hard work that goes on behind the scenes, and having the structure that supports that is crucial to enable future growth.
Okay. We will go to the audience. Есть ли какие-то вопросы? Пожалуйста.
Предшественник в этом кресле, господин Талеб, считает, что Западу, возможно, придется воевать с мусульманами, с мусульманским миром или с Китаем, что противоречия достаточно сильны и глубоки. Что вы думаете об этом? Спасибо.
Well, I haven't compared notes, and a mathematician tends to look at the world in a different way to a historian, partly because historians are more hopeful and more optimistic by nature. We believe that it's not just about pricing risk correctly, but he has a particular, Taleb has who is a great friend of mine, has a particular deep knowledge of having grown up in Lebanon and the Middle East, so sees things in a slightly different way to me. For what it's worth, and I might be wrong, it would seem to me that many of the problems that we're seeing from the so-called Muslim world, which I don't even know what that really means, most of these are problems to do with power and filling vacuums that have been left by failed states in Syria and Iraq to an extent, and also in Afghanistan. And that as a historian, I know that if you use God and you use your beliefs to justify what you do, you have a much freer hand to be able to explain what you're doing it. So I would, the people I know who are imams, people I know who take their Muslim faith very seriously, don't believe that ISIS and people who launch attacks in London or Manchester speak for them. But I think it's entirely right to say that we are at a point where explaining who is who and what's going on in the world is more important than ever. That's why I suppose I'm here in Astana as a historian to try to give a narrative to explain what's happening in the world. But it seems to me that as Asia grows and starts to become more important, more dominant, that at one end of the spectrum, China and the Belt and Road are trying to build these connections. At the other end, we see non-state actors like ISIS trying to do something similar, trying to create their own structures, their own connections, trying to link Mosul and Raqqa which don't know if they're going to hang on for so long. And one of the things that is going to be a challenge in the 21st century is how individuals and groups of individuals who are non-state related try and take matters into their own hands. But they'll be very nimble, but their job is to exploit weaknesses in our systems. And so hackers and digital hackers, ISIS, they all seem part of the same wave of people trying to take advantage of opportunities in the world.
Пожалуйста.
Я немножко застал вас, когда вы выступали на «Экономист», да, в журнал «Экономист». И там две мысли прозвучали.
Не слушаю.
Я застал ваше выступление в «Экономисте» чуть-чуть. Там прозвучало две мысли, которые мне показались интересными. Первое, то, что Китай пытается, или планирует перевести экономические влияния в регионе в политическую. И второе, прозвучало, не так достаточно акцентированно, но чем меньше инвестиций в регион, тем меньше влияния того, кто предоставляет эти инвестиции. Соответственно, вопрос возникает, где этот тот предел открытости страны, как Казахстан, да, взаимодействие в этом один пояс, один путь, да, где этот предел привлечения инвестиций с Китая, о котором сейчас на всех сейчас площадках говорится, что мы должны быть открытым больше, где этот предел, где мы не попадем в какую-то политическую зависимость в будущем.
It's about the question about China and its long-term plan. Thank you. Yeah, I'm not sure that there's I'm not sure. I don't think I'm qualified to give you a number. I think it's not exactly the question you're asking, but one of the things that's very striking about Belt and Road is that China are taking a long view on what they think is going to happen in the world, and that's something which comes as a real shock to us. It certainly comes as a shock to us in the UK, where we don't know what next week will look like because of Brexit and the decisions that we've been making. I think here in places like Kazakhstan and other countries that are Belt and Road too, one of the things that I would be doing would be trying to plot alongside Chinese plans to work out and do the same thing. What would Kazakhstan's Belt and Road look like if it was running this kind of program itself? What kind of long-term needs does this country have? What kind of skills are required? What kind of resources? And to work backwards from there. So here in Kazakhstan, like in not just most, but like in every Belt and Road country, one of the challenges is that the attention being paid by China and the amount of investment being offered, it's like a tsunami. It's so overwhelming. There's so much. And conversely, there's so little coming from other sources that it's a real challenge to try to balance those processes. And it's of course a pleasure to see so many multilateral organizations here, like the EBRD and I know the AIIB and other organizations will be hugely important in trying to ideally co-invest alongside China, or at least to be some kind of counterbalance. But keeping some independence is very important. My own view is that China doesn't have some master plan for expansion of empire. On the contrary, knowing how Chinese children, what they're taught about imperialism, it stands to reason it's absolutely the opposite. But empires get built by mistake. That's how the British ended up running 1/4 of the world. It wasn't part of a giant plan. It just so happened that they built their Belt and Road too, the British, in India and in the Caribbean and in Africa, and they built sites that protected their investment, and they became more involved in the domestic politics. That was inevitable because you're an important trading partner, and the local politicians will ask for advice and support and so on when needed. And then the next thing you know, you are over-involved. So I think one reason why my book has been very popular in China also is to try to prepare for some of the future questions that the Chinese will have as well, that it's not in their interest to have a series of satellite states who are dependent on China and become fragile, because that weakens China's economy too. But that's easier said than done. But this process of games of chess, it requires such skill. But as an educator, I would say that starts in the classroom by learning about what the likely challenges are. But here in the case of Kazakhstan, the more investment from as many other sources as possible, the better, alongside an idea of what it is that Kazakhstan will be doing with that money when it starts to grow, how it should invest its own sovereign wealth outside of Kazakhstan for its own strategic reasons, its strategic needs.
Последний вопрос, давайте.
Also really readable, so I recommend everyone in the room to pick up the Silk Road and follow it. I have two questions for you. One is, one of the impressions I get from your book is the enormous amount of trust that was necessary to trade right from Peking right over to Venice. Have you a sense of the extent to which trust still exists in the world today? And is there a way of getting a sense of how history has changed trust? And the second question then relates to modern institutions, such as the World Bank, such as the European Union, and the OECD. These were largely constructs of the post-Second World War in Europe. Have you a sense of any emergence from the Silk Road of future shape of institutions? And is there a sort of green shoot somewhere emerging? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first, thank you very much for the very kind words about my book. That financiers are reinventing the wheel. And as the gentleman just pointed out, there were highly complex credit networks in existence that operated extremely well and in a highly sophisticated way centuries, if not millennia ago. The secret to all of trade is, first of all, administration of fair justice, but second, the minimization of any forms of obstacles. You know, we can even find things like common currencies being used across thousands of miles 2,000 years ago. So, although we think that today requires new solutions and more complicated products and so on and so forth, actually we're still just answering the same questions that have been asked many, many times in the past. So levels of trust are fundamental to any form of business, and as are the correct forums to resolve them properly. But so I absolutely right. As a historian, that's the bedrock of any form of international trade. As far as the organizations go, well, you're exactly right. These were all organizations, as was the UN, set up to solve the problems at the end of the Second World War. I do work with some of the United Nations agencies, so I'm not stupid enough to say that the UN looks like it's redundant. I think it's fair to say that the UN has not got a particularly good track record at conflict resolution in places like Syria, Iraq, Sudan, Yemen, and so on and so forth. But having said that, there are very few organizations that I know that do better and more important work in their field than UNHCR and UNESCO and so on and so forth, UNDP. So, one can throw the baby out with the bathwater and demand that there is a new way in which we need to fix the world. Many of these problems are highly complex, and often they're ones that can't be resolved from outside. So I think that there is, in terms of what's happening in Asia, well, you'll all know about the different SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you'll know about the Eurasian unions and so on. There are so many different vested interests, and also there's a lot of posturing and positioning by politicians. Some of you will be politicians, so you know how to communicate to large numbers of people better than I do. But it's striking to see that from Erdogan in Turkey, who has a particular story that he's been telling for the last couple of years about a revival of Ottomanism, about turning away from Europe and so on, right the way through, which I would include ISIS, by the way, as part of that messaging that it's time for something new that doesn't involve the West. There is a sort of commonality of people trying to explain, whether it's through Islamic finance, whether it's through the Belt and Road, whether it's through Chinese global leadership. There are lots of different ways of people trying to say more or less the same thing, which is maybe this looks like a world where neighbors need to solve their own problems, and that the UN or the West either can't do it, won't do it, or is just not very good at doing it. And therefore, how does something like Afghanistan get resolved? And probably the right answer to that is that it's more likely that China, Russia, Central Asian republics, Pakistan, India, and China will have a better solution for these kinds of things than relying for outsiders thousands of miles away who've got their own wider geostrategic problems too. So I mean, in Pakistan, for example, there are 2.5 Afghan refugees who've been living there for 35 years. and the failure of the international community to resolve that partly has its roots in the Cold War, it partly has its roots in the Gulf War and 1 and 2 and these wider problems. But I think that there is a growing awareness in Asia that this is a neighborhood that needs to fix itself. The bits that I take away from the Belt and Road, from which there are many different strands of the Belt and Road, many different voices within China about what the needs and aims are, but I think that there is a sense that it is surely up to people to in this whole continent to spread their wealth more successfully, because if Kazakhstan, Pakistan, so on and so forth, can grow and become increasingly prosperous and stable and tolerant, then that's good for everybody. The thing is, it's a bit like shooting the gold in the middle of an archery board. You know, it's very hard to do that. It's very hard to make it work. What history teaches you is that there are lots of examples of equivalent belts and roads that really do work, that do enable and facilitate trade, that do spread tolerance, that do spread cultural ideas, that do spread ideas as well as goods and products, and allow people to cooperate. And in fact, we should take comfort from the fact that despite what we see on the news about failed states in the world, you know, we're very resilient as a species. We're very resilient as people who form states, because ultimately we're all after the same thing, which is to be able to get on with our own business and not have people telling us what to do. So these different organizations in Asia, I think some have been more successful than others. There are lots of different competing interests, but I think there is at the heart of it a common idea that the world really is going through a period of profound change, and how to best allow processes and dialogue and discussion and fora to allow that to happen. Probably the more that happens, the better. The purposes of forums like this is to bring people together, not necessarily to make us all agree with each other, but to then listen to ideas, go away, and then come back maybe in a year's time, or whenever it might be, and see what we can take away, what practical steps can we do to make those ingredients of stability, prosperity, and tolerance take root and grow.
Thank you so much, Peter, for sharing these ideas with us. Спасибо большое нашему спикеру. Я со своей стороны тоже могу порекомендовать, если вы найдете на русском языке эту книгу прекрасную, которую Питер написал, обязательно ее прочитать, или на английском, это проще. Большое спасибо. В течение 10 минут мы вернемся с третьим спикером. Это будет Джон Перкинс, автор бестселлера «Исповедь экономического убийцы». Поэтому я советую оставаться в зале. Спасибо. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Really kind.
Okay. Сейчас нам отключат звук.